Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be covering another one in the Eastern Ontario Open. This is round 3. I started off with donuts with castling 0-0. I ended up losing my first 2 games. Now I'm playing against Alessio, who's super nice guy, by the way. We had a good chat after this game. I learned that he played the French defense, which will actually come up later in the series, believe it or not. Even though I traveled quite a bit for this tournament, I traveled quite a bit for another one, and we have a future interaction as well. So yeah, very strong player, tactically really strong. So I got to be careful here. What you'll see here is that the rating is a 1545 for Canadian, but that's not their actual rating. They have a Quebec rating, which is much higher. So they're a very strong player, despite their Canadian rating, because they just haven't played many Canadian tournaments. So let's get into the game now. We see d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6. So we are seeing a normal semi-Slav. Bishop g5, knight bd7, e3, and you guessed it, queen a5. The Cambridge Springs here. So my opponent didn't know the Cambridge Springs that well, and they ended up playing a3, which is theoretically not too challenging. The more challenging moves here are taking on d5, moves like knight to d2, even taking on f6 is quite reasonable here. But less so the move that was played in the game, a3, because queen a5 does have a threat behind it, which is knight e4. And a3 doesn't really do anything to stop that threat. And so I play knight e4. Now here, there's actually an important thing to note. So there's 2 moves that's of interest to make note of here. One's bishop d3. And this is a cool mistake because we can take on g5 and then take on c4 here, for example. Where now we're threatening the knight and the bishop at the same time. So that's kind of like an interesting threat. There's always these like taking on c4 issues, and that's why even like bishop d3 here could run into issues as well. But okay, so yeah, that is a threat, and there's also taking on c3. So one other thing we should look at is b4. In the game, I was considering knight takes b4, c3, and I thought this was actually better for us. Not by a lot, but by an amount to kind of just be happy with here, where we can play a move like a6, and our structure is better. a3 is weak, for example. They should probably end up taking with the king because of that, to keep that pawn. We might get a position like this, and this feels like something we would be pretty happy about. We do have a weakness here, but there are weaknesses in their position. For example, we're threatening bishop d6 to c7 to just pick up the a5 pawn. Instead, in the game, my opponent played queen a4, miscalculating that there's queen takes a4, knight takes a4, knight takes g5, knight takes g5. I didn't have to throw it in. I decided to because I like the bishop pair. And then d takes c4, which actually just wins the pawn. And it wins the pawn because if bishop takes c4, there's b5. And it forks the pieces. So one might be tempted to, like, you know, play something else. I'm not really sure what, but it's a nice move to know that, like, there's a fork possible. So it actually does win the pawn outright. My opponent played g3, which is actually a very strong move. The idea is they're trying to get onto the long diagonal, where if I ever play b5 to strengthen my extra pawn, it weakens this diagonal quite a bit. So I think that was a really good consolidating choice, and it actually pays off for them in variations in the game. b5, knight c3, bishop to b7, and after bishop g2, I have to be careful. There's knight takes b5 as a threat, so I end up playing a6, because if I play something else, like let's just say bishop e7, no, bishop d6, we got to find a move that blunders it. Knight takes b5 is not possible, because we can't take back because the bishop hangs, so they win back their pawn. With interest, by the way, because after bishop d6 takes rook b8, and then bishop g2, arguably this is kind of really bad for us because they can always castle and then try to weaken our structure with some sort of b3. So that'd be very good for them. So a6 just avoids knight takes b5 altogether. Now we see castles. h6 to kick the knight, knight f3, and I ended up playing c5 immediately, which I think is a bit dubious. I think the intentions were good. The idea was I wanted to open up the diagonal as fast as possible, because after I play c5, I don't have to worry about like discoveries, and I never have to worry about pressure on the c6 pawn. But the problem is it actually weakens b5 quite a bit. Instead, I should have considered just castling instead. And the problem is, after c5, they have an interesting idea here of playing some sort of e4, or my apologies, a4 in the future, which we'll see in a variation here. So rook fe1, c takes d4, e takes d4, and now I castle. So there's also like bishop e7, which is arguably better. Knight f6 was like one of the moves as well, I believe. But the idea here with bishop e7 is that we're trying to prevent d5, because after castles, they actually have a4, which is very annoying because it actually forces us to weaken our queenside quite a bit. b4, knight d1, and at first it might look good. King b8, knight d3, and now we're starting to realize this pawn is getting a bit weaker. Rook c8, rook e to c1. And if we have to push it to c3, which we kind of have to do in order to not lose it, again, knight b6 will always be met with a5, so that would just lose the pawn immediately. Here, yeah, after c3, the pawn's getting pretty far advanced, which might feel good at first, but it's hard to tell if it's a liability or an asset at this point. So it feels like we lose a bit of our advantage there. But my opponent played rook a d1. I ended up playing g5 here to try to fianchetto my bishop, because one of the weakest pawns in their position is b2. And if they play d5, this gives me easier access to b2, or it lets me take on c3, which would also be something I'd like to play. They played d5. I took. They took with the knight and bishop g7, attacking b2. Again, if they play like knight c3, there is reasonable consideration to actually take the knight. I'm not sure if I would. I think another move I was considering was knight to c5 here, or if there's any trades or anything, moves like knight to d3 could come, and that would be very annoying. Instead, bishop h3 was played, which is a really cool move. It threatens knight b6, so I have to be careful. And I wasn't sure what to do here. I thought I messed up, but eventually I saw king b8 is totally fine. I didn't really want to take here because that would be really, really depressing. Because after I take, then they can like play rook e7. They can just add a lot of pressure. So yeah, king b8. They go back to g2 because the threat's no longer there. And now I take on b2. And that's pretty much game over at this point, actually, because now that b2 falls, a3 is really close to falling too, and then the pawns kind of just start running. Rook e7 was played, and I played rook h f8. I decided to defend f7, just to be a bit greedy here, because I didn't want to see any potential future where there's like rook takes f7 and then like the rooks get to the 7th rank. Looking at it from far away, it feels a little bit messier, but realistically it's not that big of a deal actually. Taking on a3 should actually be fine. So rook h f8, a4 now, which I think is a smart move because it's trying to break the structure, and I can't play b4 because the knight can take that, so I end up taking. But the problem is these pawns are still quite strong because my bishop can defend everything, and that's what ends up happening. So rook b1, a3, knight b4, and a5. So a5 is just to kick the knight back, because they kind of have to go to a2 here. If they don't go to a2, then there's not really any good, like, better square either. Maybe knight c2 actually, but then we run into moves like rook e8, which kind of just end the game because of this important move here, bishop e4. But the reason why that's important is because, like, if they move somewhere else, like, let's just say it's really hard to find a move, actually. I don't even think there is a move. Yeah, I don't think there is actually a reasonable move to say, let's just say knight a3. Here, for example, well, there's a2, yeah. But a5, they can't really move anywhere other than, like, a2 or c2. But a2, and then we can promote, right? So this wins. Now we see knight b4. I play a5, of course, kicking the knight a2. Rook fe8, rook takes f7, and then I play bishop to e4, just to kick the knight from the square. And after rook to e1, I play knight c5, and my opponent resigns. The big idea here is I'm potentially looking to trade, but more so I'm interested in pushing or in escorting this pawn down by trapping this knight. So with knight c5, I'm covering b7. So I'm ready to potentially move bishop c2 as well to b3 to attack the knight, and the knight can't really move. So eventually I'm going to break that constellation, and the pawns are going to just start rolling through. So the game is over. Despite my king being a little open, the knight on c5 is like a saving grace because it covers b7, which is the weakest square in my position because of the g2 bishop. So yeah, again, my opponent ends up resigning here, so I was pretty lucky. I kind of just got lucky from the opening because they didn't really know the opening as well. Now they've done some serious prep in it, as they've said, so I'm sure that this will never ever happen again. But yeah, kind of just a lucky opening choice, really. So I was really happy to win this one. Now I am 1 out of 3. I'm on a -1 score, which is, of course, better than being on a -2 score as I was earlier. So that's going to cover it for this game, and I will see you guys in round number 4 of the Eastern Ontario Open. Have a good one. Bye-bye.